Nicolas Cage was once one of the most unique names in Hollywood, an actor who did not follow any mold but still reached heights that few could touch. He won the Oscar for Best Actor for Leaving Las Vegas in 1996, a role considered the pinnacle of emotional acting when he embodied a self-destructive man. In addition, he received a Golden Globe and many other prestigious nominations. His career spanned many genres, from blockbuster action films like The Rock, Face Off, Con Air to the famous adventure series National Treasure, helping him become one of the box office guarantees for many years. He was not only a commercial star but also recognized by professionals for his diverse transformative ability, daring to experiment and daring to go beyond the safe limits of traditional acting. That boldness created a distinctive style, making Nicolas Cage an unmistakable icon in American film history. A person who could both conquer mainstream audiences and make critics debate, a man whose career is a combination of brilliant success and choices that no one dared to make. But behind all those achievements is a completely different story, a second life that not everyone sees, where he had to face severe financial pressure when mounting debts forced him to sell assets that were once symbols of success, where broken relationships left voids that could not be filled, where his image was turned into a joke by the internet through memes and edited expressions, and in all of that he did not disappear, did not walk away, but continued to work non-stop, taking consecutive roles to survive, to keep his career, to not completely lose himself. He lives with two parallel lives, one life in front of the public full of noise and prejudice, and one inner life full of wounds but also full of will, and it is precisely in that contradiction that Nicolas Cage does not only exist as a star, but as a human being still fighting every day, not to return to the peak, but to not collapse completely. If this story makes you see Nicolas Cage in a different way, please hit subscribe and leave a heart so we can continue exploring the hidden corners that the world has never seen. Born with the name Nicolas Kim Coppola, Nicolas Cage never had the chance to enter life as an ordinary person, because from the very first moment, he belonged to a family whose name was enough to make all of Hollywood fall silent. A family where cinema was not just a profession but a legacy, where every success was carved into history and every failure became an unhideable crack. In that enormous shadow, Francis Ford Coppola was not just an uncle, but an icon, a standard that was almost impossible to reach, a name that had redefined American cinema and unintentionally also defined the expectations placed on the child who carried the same blood. Before Nicolas even understood who he was, the world already knew what he should become, and that created a silent pressure, an invisible weight pressing down on his earliest steps, where every gaze did not ask what he wanted to do, but only waited to see if he was worthy of the Coppola name. In a world like that, being seen as an independent individual was almost impossible, because every time he appeared, the name behind him always came first, like a shadow that could not be separated, making all his efforts seem constantly doubted, not because he lacked talent, but because people were not sure if that talent truly belonged to him or was just the continuation of an overwhelmingly large legacy. But if the family spotlight made life outside feel suffocating, inside his home it was not a place that brought the peace a child needed either. His mother, Joy Vogelsang, was a woman who once carried artistic dreams but had to live with prolonged psychological instability, sudden mood swings, heavy silences that no one could explain, making the family atmosphere always teeter between love and instability. Nicolas grew up in an environment where emotions were never truly stable, where a day could begin with fragile calm but end with incomprehensible voids, and for a child, that not only created anxiety but also formed a deep sense that the world was not a safe place, that everything could change at any moment without reason. And perhaps it was in those years that he learned to withdraw into himself, learned to observe more than to express, learned to keep emotions inside rather than let them spill out, because he was not sure that the world around him was stable enough to receive them. Nicolas's childhood did not lack opportunities, but it lacked something much more important, the feeling of belonging. He did not fully belong to the prestigious family whose name he carried because he always felt he was not enough, but he also did not belong to the outside world where people viewed him through the lens of a famous name, and that sense of alienation made him grow up with a nameless void, a feeling as if he was living in a story that had already been written, where the role had been decided in advance but he was not the one who wrote it. Every step he took carried hesitation, not because of a lack of determination but because he was never allowed to start from zero, never allowed to fail without comparison, never allowed to succeed without questions. And the most painful thing was not what he had to face but the fact that he had to face all of it before he truly understood who he was, before he had the chance to choose his own path, before he could say that this life was his. And perhaps that is why, from a very young age, Nicolas Cage was not only trying to become an actor, but was trying to escape a name, escape a shadow, escape a definition that the world had imposed on him long before he could even speak his first words. And then, in a decision that at first glance seemed like just a career choice, but was actually a painful severance, Nicolas Cage abandoned the Coppola surname, the name that had defined his entire family, the name that carried power, opportunities, and heavy expectations, to give himself a new name, Nicolas Cage, not to stand out more, but to start over like an unknown person, someone not tied to anyone's legacy, someone who could fail without comparison, who could succeed without suspicion. But what he did not anticipate was that erasing a name did not mean erasing its shadow, because Hollywood does not forget, and people do not forget either. The whispers still existed behind every audition, the glances still carried doubt, not because he lacked ability, but because people always wondered if he was being favored. And precisely in the effort to prove that he did not need any special privileges, he faced a cruel paradox. The more he tried to separate himself, the more closely he was scrutinized. In the early days entering the industry, he was not welcomed as an heir, but as someone who had to prove himself twice, even 3 times, to stand on equal footing with others. Unsuccessful auditions, rejected roles, cold comments that he was not suitable, too different, not the right fit, all piled up into a series of being underestimated, where every closed door was not just a lost opportunity, but also a reminder that he had still not escaped the shadow he was trying to run from. And in those moments, he was no longer Coppola, but he was not yet truly Cage either. He existed in a space in between, a region that belonged to no identity, where the past had been rejected but the future had not yet accepted him, and that very alienation made his journey lonelier than anyone could imagine. He could not return to his family for protection because he had left on his own, and he could not fully step into the new world with confidence because every step was overlaid with questions that were never asked directly, whether he truly deserved it, whether he was trying too hard to prove something. And in that process, something began to form, not as a conscious choice, but as a survival mechanism. He began to live 2 lives at the same time, one life where he appeared before others as Nicolas Cage, a young actor trying to find his place, and another life, deeper and more hidden, where he still carried all the pressure, the expectations, the cracks from the Coppola name he had tried to abandon. These 2 lives were not completely separate, but they never fully merged either. They existed in parallel, sometimes overlapping, sometimes pulling him in different directions, making every decision not just a career move, but also an internal struggle between becoming who he wanted to be and who the world thought he must be. And it was precisely in this period, when he did not yet have enough success to protect himself, when he did not yet have a strong enough reputation to define himself, that Nicolas Cage learned to exist in uncertainty, in doubt, in the feeling that he always had to run a little faster, do a little more, endure a little more, just to be able to stand still without being pulled back. And perhaps the most painful thing was not the failures themselves, but the fact that he could not share those failures with anyone, because he had chosen this path alone, had abandoned the old name alone, and now also had to prove his worth alone, in a world that had never truly given him a foundation to start over from scratch. And when he had accepted stepping onto the path without the Coppola name to shelter him, Nicolas Cage was forced to find a different way to exist, a way that made people see him not because of his family, but because of who he was. But instead of choosing safety like many other young actors, he went in a direction that few dared to touch. He did not try to fit into Hollywood's existing molds, did not learn to soften his emotions, did not find ways to make his roles more understandable to the masses. Instead, he pushed everything further, stronger, deeper, as if every role was not just a job but an opportunity to release what he had held inside for too long. And that choice immediately made him a controversial name, an actor whom people did not know where to place, not standard enough to be considered safe, but not easy enough to be widely accepted. Viewers seeing him for the first time often did not know how to react because the way he expressed emotions did not follow ordinary logic. Sometimes it was too big, sometimes too silent, sometimes explosive, sometimes almost shattered. And in an industry where everything was measured by the ability to control, he was labeled as someone out of control, a strange actor, excessive, unpredictable. Those comments were not just professional evaluations but gradually became part of a reputation he never wanted. But what few realized was that what they called excessive was actually what was most authentic, because Nicolas Cage did not act with safe technique. He did not build characters from proven formulas. Instead, he stepped into roles with his own emotions, with memories, with instabilities, with fears that he had never had the chance to resolve. And when those things were brought to the screen without the filter of control, they became difficult to understand, even difficult to accept for those accustomed to order. And because of that, the more he tried to express himself honestly, the further he was pushed from the center of recognition. Every role became a double-edged sword. It helped him affirm his difference, but it also isolated him more in an industry that did not easily accept what lay outside the norm. There were filming days when he poured all his energy, channeling every emotion into every moment, only to receive puzzled looks, silences without praise, without confirmation, as if what he did was something too alien to be understood immediately. And gradually, an image began to form in the public's eyes, not of an actor searching for truth in acting, but of someone unusual, someone hard to understand, someone people were not sure whether to take seriously or to laugh at. And that was where his first life and second life continued to drift further apart, because while the public began to associate him with strangeness and unpredictable expressions, inside he was only trying to hold on to something very simple, the feeling of being himself, something he had fought for since he was very young. And perhaps what made everything more painful was that he could not stop, could not return to a safer way, because if he abandoned this way of acting, he would lose the only thing that made him feel he truly existed. And so he continued walking on a path where the further he went, the fewer people understood, the further he went, the lonelier he became, but also the closer he came to the real person he had never had the chance to live fully, a person that Hollywood did not know how to accept, and that the world had never been patient enough to understand. Then finally, after all those years of being looked at with skeptical eyes, roles considered too different and too hard to understand, Nicolas Cage began to be noticed, not in a loud or easy way, but as a slow recognition given to someone unlike anyone else. Bigger opportunities gradually opened up, deeper roles found their way to him, and for the first time the name Nicolas Cage was no longer on the sidelines of Hollywood, but began to be mentioned as a real individual, an actor with his own color and his own voice. But right in the moment when many people thought he had finally arrived, inside him there was no sense of victory, no relief, only a void that remained intact, as if everything he had achieved was still not enough to fill something that had been missing for a very long time. And perhaps what made this period even heavier was that success did not erase the insecurity. Instead, it made the insecurity clearer, because when he had nothing, he could blame the circumstances, the opportunities, the doors that had not opened. But when he had opportunities, when the light shone on him, every gaze turned toward him, and the question was no longer whether he could do it, but whether he deserved what he had. And that question became a silent but persistent pressure, forcing him to prove himself continuously, not only to others but to himself. Every role was no longer just an opportunity but became a test. Every small success did not bring a sense of security but only brought a greater worry. Whether this was the last time, whether he could do better, whether someone else would replace him tomorrow. And in an industry where everything changed very quickly, where new faces appeared every day, the fear of being replaced was not an unreasonable fear, but a reality that anyone had to face. But for Nicolas Cage, that fear was not only about his career but also about his identity, because he had given so much to build this person, had abandoned the old name, had accepted isolation, had gone through years of not being understood. And now, if all of that was not enough to keep him, then who would he be? Where would he return to? And that very thought made him unable to stop, unable to relax, unable to simply enjoy what he had achieved. While on the outside his life seemed to be rising with praise, opportunities, and increasingly bigger roles, inside, his other life began to separate more clearly. A life where he was still the boy who had always felt he did not belong anywhere, still the person who always doubted his own worth, still the person who was not sure whether what he had was due to talent or just a series of temporary luck. And these two lives no longer moved in parallel peacefully, but began to pull him in different directions. One side was light, recognition and expectations, and the other side was darkness, doubt, and nameless fear. And the further he stepped on the path of success, the greater the distance between those two lives became, making him no longer feel like a unified whole, but like two different people forced to live in the same body. There were moments, in the middle of a crowded film set, amid the lights, the directions, the applause, when he still felt completely alone, not because there was no one around, but because no one truly saw the person inside, No one saw what was happening behind the face they thought they understood, and that very loneliness made every success feel lighter and thinner, like a shell that could break at any moment. And while others looked and saw an upward journey, for Nicolas Cage it was a journey where every step forward came with a greater fear, every open door brought a new question, and every moment of recognition reminded him that all of this could disappear as quickly as it had come, leaving him once again standing in the void he had tried to escape from for so long, but had never truly escaped. And then the moment the whole world called a victory finally arrived, when Nicolas Cage stepped into the role in Leaving Las Vegas, a man destroying himself with alcohol, a soul no longer seeking salvation, but only waiting for the end. And what made that role haunting was not the story, but the way he dissolved himself into it, not like an actor performing, but like a person touching the deepest, darkest parts of his own inner self. He did not try to control the character, did not soften the sharp edges, but let everything raw, painful, and most exposed pour out, making every glance, every movement carry the feeling as if he was not acting but living inside that very breakdown. And when the film was released, the world could no longer ignore him. They saw something they had not understood before, an excessive honesty, a pain left uncovered, and that was what brought him to the peak he had pursued from the very first days. When his name was called at the Oscar ceremony, when the golden statue was placed in his hands, when the entire auditorium stood up to applaud, that was the moment any actor would dream of, an absolute recognition, a milestone no one could deny. But right in that moment, amid the bright lights and the long rounds of applause, there was something that did not match, a void that still existed, as if everything he had achieved did not touch the place he had always tried to fill. That victory did not bring healing, did not erase the insecurities that had existed before, did not make the questions inside him disappear. Instead, it made everything clearer, because once he had reached the peak, there was nowhere higher to aim for, and the only thing left was to hold that position, a task much harder than climbing up, because every step after that was compared to the very perfect moment he had just experienced. And from then on, the pressure began to change shape, no longer the pressure to prove himself to gain recognition, but the pressure to maintain that recognition, to continue deserving a title he did not always feel he truly owned. The roles after the Oscar were no longer simple opportunities but became burdens. Every script brought to him carried an invisible question, whether he could do better, or at least not worse. And in an industry that never stood still, where the public's memory could change quickly, the fear of falling from the position he had just reached began to creep into every decision, every choice, making him no longer as free as before, no longer able to simply follow his own emotions, but having to consider, to measure, to face a standard he himself had created. And that gradually blurred the line between his true self and the image he had to maintain. There were times during filming sessions, during interviews, amid non-stop praise, when he still felt he was standing outside it all, like a person observing his own life from afar, not fully connected to what was happening, as if he had achieved everything people thought was important, but could not touch the feeling he had always been searching for. And that very alienation made the peak lonelier than any previous stage, because when he had nothing, he could hope that one day everything would get better. But when he had everything and still felt something was missing, then hope also began to become fragile. His inner self, which already had cracks from before, began to crack deeper under the weight of expectations and uncertainty. Thoughts he once could push away now became clearer, more persistent, no longer hidden by the busyness of pursuing success, but appearing in the rare moments of silence, when he had nothing left to do but face himself. And in those moments, the Oscar was no longer a symbol of victory, but became a reminder that he had reached the peak, but still had not found what he had always been searching for. And perhaps it was from here that his two lives not only drifted further apart, but began to collide more forcefully, when the image of a winner no longer matched the feeling of a person gradually losing direction inside, and that mismatch did not create noise immediately, but silently accumulated, like small cracks on the surface, not easy to notice but enough to signal that something inside was beginning to change in a direction that no one, not even he himself, could fully control. After the peak that Leaving Las Vegas brought, Nicolas Cage's path ahead did not slow down at all. Instead, it accelerated with a pull that even he could not resist. Hollywood opened its doors wider with big projects, large-scale action films, roles that demanded strong appeal more than inner depth, and in a very short time, he became the center of works like The Rock, Face Off, and Con Air, films that not only succeeded at the box office, but also etched his image into the minds of global audiences. an action star with explosive energy, with unmistakable intensity, with expressions and ways of performing that made people unable to look away. And those successes brought him to a position few could reach, a box office guarantee, a name that could draw millions to theaters just by his appearance. But it was also from here that something else began to happen. Not loudly, not immediately clear, but strong enough to change the entire way he was perceived, because when an image became too successful, it was no longer a choice but became a mold, and that mold began to define him instead of him defining it. Hollywood no longer saw him as an actor who could do anything but as an icon that needed to be maintained, an image that needed to be repeated, a formula that needed to be exploited, and in that process, his true self was gradually pushed back, giving way to a version the market demanded. He continued to work, continued to take roles, continued to appear in big projects, but each time like that, the gap between what he wanted to express and what he was required to express widened a little more. His personal edges, complex emotions, the things that made him different, were gradually obscured by action scenes, scripts calculated to suit the masses, and even though he still tried to bring in a part of himself, tried to keep the honesty in every moment, those efforts became harder to notice because the image had become too big, too clear, too easily recognizable for people to look deeper inside. The public began to see him in a simpler, easier to understand way. They no longer looked for depth in his acting but waited for what they were familiar with. Strong expressions, explosive moments, roles they could recognize immediately. And while that brought stability in terms of reputation, it also took away a part of his freedom, a part of the ability to change, to experiment, to fail without judgment, and that loss could not be measured by money or by the number of films, but by the feeling of becoming increasingly alien to himself. There were days when he worked non-stop, from one project to the next, moving from one set to another, with a schedule so packed that there was no space left to stop, to think, to feel. And at first glance, that was the image of a successful person, someone constantly moving forward, but inside, that rhythm of life became a way to avoid facing what was gradually changing, because if he stopped, he would have to look at the growing gap between the person he once wanted to become and the person the world was seeing. And that was a gap not easy to accept. Fame, which he once pursued as a way to affirm his existence, now began to take on a different shape. It was no longer a reward but became a lasting burden, something he had to carry in every choice, every decision, something that did not allow him to return to the starting point, did not allow him to make normal mistakes, did not allow him to disappear in silence when necessary, because every time he appeared, he did not appear just as a person but as an image that millions were familiar with, and that image was not easy to change. Meanwhile, his second life, the life without cameras or lights, continued to exist, still carrying the insecurities, the questions, the cracks that had never been healed. And as these two lives became increasingly different, the collision between them became clearer, no longer just a vague feeling but a prolonged state, where he had to constantly switch between two versions of himself, one version the world expected, and one version he could not completely abandon. And that division made every success feel heavier, every step forward more difficult, because it was no longer just a step ahead, but a step further away from the person he once thought he would become. And perhaps the scariest thing was not losing control, but realizing that he was gradually becoming someone he himself no longer clearly recognized as before. And while fame continued to pull him further down a path he did not always truly choose, Nicolas Cage's personal life began to show cracks that no spotlight could hide. The relationships he entered often started with intense emotions, with quick connections, as if he was trying to hold on to something solid in a world that was always changing. And among them, the marriage to Patricia Arquette was not just a love story, but a journey that stretched over many years before it truly began. An almost obsessive pursuit where he put not only love, but also the hope that he could finally find a place to stop, a place where he did not need to act, did not need to prove, did not need to become anyone other than himself. And when they got married, in a brief moment, that seemed to become reality, but that peace did not last, because what he carried inside could not simply disappear just because someone was by his side. The pressures, the insecurities, the invisible distances still existed, seeping into every day, every moment, until the relationship no longer had the strength to hold what had begun. And when it ended, it was not just a breakup, but a collapse of a belief that there could exist a stable place for him in this life. After that, the marriage to Lisa Marie Presley happened like another explosion, quick, intense, almost without time to build a solid foundation. Two people carrying large legacies and their own pressures, found each other like a reflection of themselves, but precisely because of that they could not maintain balance. Because when two unstable worlds collided, they did not create solidity but only made everything more fragile. And the end came as quickly as it began, leaving behind not relief, but a larger, deeper void that was harder to fill. These relationships did not fail because of a lack of emotion, but perhaps because the emotions were too big, too strong, to the point they could not be sustained in a world that demanded stability. And each time like that he carried another piece of breakdown into his life. Not in the form of stories the press could tell, but in the form of silences that only he could feel. Moments when everything ended and there was nothing left to hold on to. When the room became quieter. When what once brought closeness disappeared, leaving an emptiness that no role could replace. Fame, which from the outside seemed to bring countless opportunities, in reality became a factor that increased the distance in his relationships, because it not only attracted attention but also brought expectations, pressures, and gazes that not everyone could endure. And in a relationship, when one person always had to exist under that light, keeping things normal became almost impossible. Private moments became rare, misunderstandings became easier to happen, and small gaps, if not filled, quickly turned into large cracks that could not be repaired. With each breakdown, he did not only lose a relationship, but lost a part of the hope that he could build something lasting. And the loneliness did not come immediately, but grew over time, like something accumulating, each loss adding a little more, each ending going a little deeper, until it was no longer a passing feeling, but became a familiar state, a part of life he had to learn to live with, even though he had never truly accepted it. And in all of that, what made everything more painful was not that the relationships did not last, but that he had truly wanted them to last, had truly believed that this time would be different, that this time he would find the stability he had always searched for. But each time hope was placed in, each time that hope broke in a different way, leaving him once again standing between two lives, one life where he continued to move forward, continued to work, continued to appear before the public as if everything was still okay, and another life where he had to face the voids that no one could see, voids that could not be filled with fame, with money, or with any success. And precisely in that repetition, his loneliness was no longer a moment, but became an inseparable part of the journey he had chosen, even though perhaps that was never what he truly wanted. And when the relationships left one after another, leaving behind voids that no explanation could fill, Nicolas Cage began to search for something else to hold on to, not people but things he could grasp, could own, could control, assets, objects, spaces that he could call his own. And from there, a new phase in his life took shape, a phase that from the outside looked like unlimited luxury, but from the inside carried the color of a desperate effort to fill what could not be named. He bought houses not just to live in but to create different shelters for himself, ancient castles in Europe, vast villas, luxurious spaces where every room carried the feeling that he was trying to build a private world, separated from what had hurt him. He collected things that others did not understand, from rare comic books to historical artifacts, even things so strange they were hard to explain, not because he needed them but because in the moment of ownership they brought a feeling of control that his life had never truly had, a feeling that at least some part of this world was stable, was certain, was not going to leave him like the people who once had. But right in that process the boundary began to blur, because when ownership became the only way to feel stability, it no longer stopped at what was necessary but gradually went beyond limits. The spending grew larger and larger, the decisions became less and less controlled, and a cycle began to form where each purchase did not bring long-lasting satisfaction, but only a brief moment, after which it returned to the initial state, forcing him to search for more, to own more, as if only if he had enough he would feel complete. But that never happened. The things he acquired grew more and more, but their value became harder and harder to feel, because when an object no longer carried personal meaning but was only part of an accumulation chain, it no longer had the ability to fill any void. And gradually, what was once seen as success began to become a burden. The assets were no longer shelters but became responsibilities. The objects were no longer joys but became signs of something losing control. But in that very process he did not easily realize what was happening, because from the outside everything still looked like a successful life, a man enjoying what he had, a star living up to the image the public expected. Meanwhile inside, the void was still there, unchanged, not shrinking, not disappearing, and each time he tried to fill it with material things, it only became clearer, deeper, like a reminder that what he was searching for was not in things that could be bought. But when he realized that, he had already gone too far to easily turn back, because his life at that point was no longer balanced, no longer stable, but tilted to one side, where everything operated on an unsustainable rhythm, a rhythm he had to maintain to avoid facing the emptiness waiting behind. And in that very imbalance, his two lives continued to drift further apart, one life where he appeared with the image of a man who owned everything, and another life where he gradually realized that everything he had was still not enough to bring what he had always been searching for long before he had the ability to buy anything. And that very gap not only created fatigue but also laid the foundation for something bigger, a collapse that did not come immediately but was gradually forming in silence, like an inevitable consequence of a life that had gone too far from the balance point he had never truly had the chance to keep. What began as a quiet imbalance finally found its breaking point, and this time it was no longer within the range that Nicolas Cage could control or hide. When financial problems accumulated over many years suddenly appeared clearly before his eyes, no longer abstract numbers or private decisions, but a reality that could not be avoided. When tax authorities began to demand enormous amounts of money, when financial management mistakes could no longer be compensated by new contracts or following projects, and for the first time after many years, he had to face a truth he could not interpret the way he wanted, that everything was slipping out of control, that what he had built was not only shaking but was truly collapsing piece by piece. The assets that were once symbols of success, the houses, the spaces, the things he once believed could bring a feeling of stability, were now sold off one by one, not because he wanted to change but because he had no other choice. Each transaction was not only a material loss but a gradual dismantling of the world he had tried to build to protect himself. And along with that came lawsuits, disputes, accusations related to financial management, confrontations that no longer took place in silence but appeared on the pages of newspapers, in headlines he could not control, could not edit, could not soften. And from then on his image began to change rapidly, not in the eyes of those who truly understood him but in the eyes of the wider public, those who only saw what was presented to them. From someone once admired, once a symbol of success, he gradually became a cautionary tale, an example of decline, a name mentioned not with respect but with mockery. Stories about spending, about decisions considered thoughtless, about strange assets, all were gathered into a simplified image, an image that people could easily laugh at, easily judge, without needing to understand the full context. And while that was happening, the gap between his two lives was no longer just a quiet difference but became a direct collision, where the life he had tried to maintain no longer had the strength to cover the life he was truly living. The pressure from reality at this point was no longer an inner feeling but a concrete weight, present in every decision, every choice, every day that passed. He not only had to face losing what he owned, but also had to face losing control over how his story was told, when every step he took was followed, analyzed, turned into part of a story where he was no longer the writer. And that made everything much more difficult, because not only did he have to solve the real problems, he also had to live with the image the world was creating about him, an image that was not completely wrong but was never complete. In this phase there was no longer room for hiding, no space to separate the two lives, because what once happened in silence had now become public. The issues once kept private now appeared before everyone's eyes, and he no longer had the ability to choose how he was perceived, only the ability to choose how he continued to move forward, while everything around him seemed to be shrinking, with fewer directions, fewer choices, only one single path left, to face what had happened and find a way to go on through it. And perhaps what made this phase heavier than anything before was not only the loss but the change in the way the world looked at him, because losing money could be compensated, losing assets could be rebuilt, but when a person's image was shaped in a way they did not control, regaining balance became much more difficult. And it was precisely in that circumstance that Nicolas Cage was no longer a star going through a difficult period, but a human being standing in the middle of an unavoidable reality, where every layer of shell had been peeled away, where the second life was no longer a secret but became the only part left that he had to learn to accept and live with. After all the layers of shell had been peeled away, and what could once be hidden no longer existed, Nicolas Cage stood before a reality he could not avoid, that the only way to move forward was not to immediately regain what had been lost, but to start from something much more basic, working, not as an artistic choice but as a need for existence. And from there, another phase began, a phase where he appeared in many consecutive projects, films of different scales, roles that were not always highly rated, choices that if viewed from the outside could easily be understood as hasty, lacking selectivity, even trading reputation, But behind those decisions was a pressure that could not be postponed, debts that needed to be resolved, responsibilities that needed to be shouldered, consequences of the past that needed to be handled piece by piece. And in that circumstance, refusing an opportunity was no longer simply a career choice but became a risk he could not accept. The public began to look at this phase with a different perspective, no longer with admiration but with suspicion. Comments appeared that he took roles for money, that he lost his standards, that he was no longer like before. And those words, even if partly based on what they saw, did not reflect the full truth, because what they did not see was what he was facing behind each decision, the pressures that could not be postponed, the choices that were not completely free. And while his image continued to be simplified into an easy-to-understand story, his real life was much more complex, where each role was not just a step in his career, but part of the process of repairing what had been broken. He worked non-stop, not at the rhythm of someone at the peak but at the rhythm of someone trying to keep himself from sinking, with a packed schedule, days following one after another with not much space, projects coming and going continuously, and in all of that the boundary between choice and obligation began to blur, because when a person had to work to solve problems that could not be postponed, the concept of free choice was no longer as clear as before. A role was no longer judged only by the script or the director, but by whether it could help him move closer to stabilizing his life again. There were times, on a strange film set with people he had just met, when he still had to maintain a professional image, still had to complete his role, while inside, thoughts about reality kept appearing, about what had been lost, about what still needed to be resolved, about the next steps he was not sure he was ready for. And that very parallelism between work and personal life, between what he showed and what he truly felt, made every day that passed not just a work day but a day of existence, a day when he had to keep everything from collapsing further. Gradually, working was no longer a part of life, but became the center of it, a structure that helped him maintain stability in a world that had lost many anchors. And while that helped him continue moving forward, it also took away another part, a part related to stopping, thinking, feeling, because when everything was filled with work, there was not much space left to face what lay inside. And perhaps to some extent, that was also necessary, because if he stopped for too long, what he had tried to hold steady could start shaking again. But right in that process, another change took place. Not loud, not easy to notice, but deep enough to affect the way he saw himself, when he began to no longer be sure what was what he chose and what was what he was forced to do, when decisions no longer came completely from desire, but from need, from circumstances, from pressure, and the boundary between the two became increasingly hard to distinguish, making the feeling of control, something he had tried to search for in many different ways, once again become fragile. And in all of that, one truth still did not change, that even though he was misunderstood, even though he was underestimated, even though he had to work under conditions that were not always ideal, he still continued, did not stop, did not disappear, did not give up, because for Nicolas Cage, continuing to work was not only a way to solve the problems right in front of him, but also a way to keep a part of himself, a part not defined by what had happened, but by what he was still trying to do, every day, every role, every step, in a journey that was not always understood, but still had to be continued. And when work became the only way to keep everything from collapsing further, then another part of Nicolas Cage's life began to grow heavy in a way that no role could help him escape. That was the role of being a father, a role with no script, no director, no chance to redo, where every decision carried real consequences and every mistake left long-lasting marks. His son Weston grew up in an unusual world, a world where fame was always present, where every action could be seen and judged, and over time, Weston's psychological and behavioral issues began to appear more clearly, no longer small signs that could be overlooked, but specific situations, events that the media did not miss, moments when the family could no longer keep them private. And in all of that, Nicolas Cage did not stand outside as an observer, but was pulled in as a father who had to face what was happening without having enough tools to control it. He tried to protect his son in the ways he could, keeping distance between Weston and the public scrutiny, limiting what could be exaggerated, trying to keep private matters from becoming newspaper headlines. But in a world where everything could be recorded and spread, those efforts were not always enough. And each time a story appeared, each time an image was shared, it was not only a time when Weston was put under the spotlight, but also a time when Nicolas Cage had to face the fact that he could not completely control what was happening inside his own family. The feeling of helplessness, which he had experienced in other aspects of his life, now appeared in a different form, deeper and heavier, because it no longer related to his career or fame, but to a relationship he could not separate from, a responsibility he could not put down. And each time things became difficult, the question was no longer what he would do next in his work, but what he could do to help his son, a question with no clear answer, no certain direction, only continuous efforts, decisions made under imperfect conditions, and consequences he had to accept, whether prepared or not. Family pressure, which had already existed, now piled on top of the personal pressure he was still carrying from the years before, creating a weight that was not easy to share, because not everything could be spoken, not every pain could be explained, and there were things that, if brought to light, would not help but only make everything more complicated. And so he kept most of what he was going through to himself, not because he did not want to share but because he could not, because the role of a father sometimes demanded silence, endurance, the acceptance that there were things that had to be carried without support from the outside. In the rare moments when there were no cameras, no lights, no packed schedule, those thoughts became clearer, not distracted by work, not obscured by outside demands, and precisely in those silences, he had to face the feeling that even though he had achieved so much in life, there were things he could not control, could not fix immediately, and that not only created pain, but also created a heavy sense of responsibility, a feeling that he had to do more, had to try harder, even though he was not sure where those efforts would lead. The responsibility of being a father, in this circumstance, was no longer a balanced part of life, but became a prolonged mental burden, something always present in the background of every thought, every decision, every action. And even though he still continued to work, still continued to appear, still continued to keep the rhythm he had grown used to, inside, a part of him was always pulled toward that, toward what was happening in the family, toward the things he could not solve with experience or with fame. And that very separation, between what he had to do and what he wanted to do, between what he could control and what he could not, continued to make his two lives more complicated, more overlapping and harder to separate, in a journey with no script, no clear stopping point, only the next steps that he had to find a way to take, day by day, moment by moment, in an effort not to win but to keep what remained from breaking further. And while the inner pressures kept piling up, another layer of reality began to form on the outside, not in the movies, not on the red carpet, but in a space that Nicolas Cage could almost not control, that was the internet, where every image could be taken out of context, every moment could be distorted, and every person could be reduced to a simple, easily consumed, easily spread symbol. His expressions, the moments when he poured all his emotion into a role, the facial expressions created from a complex inner process, began to be cut, repeated, exaggerated, and spread at a speed no one could stop, from short clips and still images to memes that millions shared. And gradually a new image of him was formed, not as an Oscar-winning actor, not as an artist with his own style, but as a weird face, a symbol of the excessive, a character that people could laugh at without needing to understand. The public began to see him through that lens, no longer looking for depth in what he did, but only waiting for the moments they could recognize, the expressions they were familiar with, the images they could easily share, and in that process, his true self gradually became obscured, not because he changed but because the way he was perceived had changed. And that was not a shift he could intervene in, because the internet did not need permission, did not need confirmation, it only needed content, and once there was content, it would continue to spread in a way no one could fully control. In that circumstance, he did not have many opportunities to explain, did not have space to give a fuller version of the story, because what was spread was not long interviews, not deep analyses, but short moments, isolated images, and in those moments, everything complex was removed, leaving only what was easy to understand, easy to remember, and easy to react to. And so no matter what he said or did, changing the image that had formed in the public's mind became extremely difficult, almost impossible in a short time. This was the phase when his two lives became the most distinct, no longer just an inner feeling, but a visible separation. One side the image the internet created, a simplified, exaggerated, easily recognizable version, and the other side the real person, with all the complexity, the contradictions, the efforts that were not always recognized. And the gap between those two sides not only existed but grew larger, making the connection between them more difficult, not only with others but with himself. There were times when he stepped into a public space and felt the gazes of those around him, not the gazes of curiosity or admiration like before, but the gazes of recognition in a different way, a way he did not fully control, a way he could not change immediately. And in those moments, the feeling of isolation did not come from having no one around, but from having no one who truly saw the person behind the image, a feeling as if he was existing in a story where he was no longer the main character, but only a symbol used in many different ways. Fame, which once brought opportunities and opened doors, now carried a different meaning. It was no longer just recognition but a shell he had to carry, a shell that did not always accurately reflect who he was, but was the first thing others saw. And living inside that shell, day after day, was not easy, because it demanded acceptance, patience, and sometimes silence in the face of misunderstandings he could not fix immediately. And in all of that, what made this phase heavier was not being misunderstood, but having to live with that misunderstanding for a long time, with no quick way to change it, no immediate solution, only slow steps, choices he had to continue making, while accepting that his image might not fully reflect who he was. And precisely in that acceptance, another form of loneliness appeared, not loud, not dramatic, but prolonged, a feeling of being separated even within his own fame, a state he had to learn to exist in, not by immediately changing the way the world saw him, but by continuing to be himself, even knowing that it was not always seen or understood correctly. And then, after the years of being defined by images he did not control, after the periods when every choice seemed driven more by pressure than desire, a change began to take place in Nicolas Cage's life, not in the form of a big announcement, with no sudden moment that reversed everything, but happening slowly, almost silently, like a person beginning to return to himself after having gone too far from the starting point. Roles like Mandy and Pig appeared not as clearly commercial projects but as opportunities for him to do what he had always searched for from the early days, which was to act truthfully, unbound by market expectations, not framed in a ready-made image. And in those roles, there was something different that even people familiar with him could feel, not a complete change, but the return of a part that had once been obscured, a part he had not had the chance to express fully for a long time. In Mandy, he did not only show anger or pain, but brought into it an emotional depth that did not need to be explained in words, an approach that did not try to make it easier for the audience to understand, but accepted that there were things that could only be felt. And in Pig, the change was even clearer. No longer the familiar explosions, no longer the exaggerated expressions, but a prolonged silence, a way of performing where every glance, every pause carried meaning. And precisely in that silence, people began to see a different Nicolas Cage, not the version the internet was familiar with, but a person with control, with depth, with a more subtle approach, an approach where he did not need to prove anything, but only needed to exist fully in his role. These films did not immediately change the entire way the public saw him, but they created a different space, a different way of looking, where those willing to look deeper could realize that what they once thought about him was only part of the story, that behind the repeated and simplified images there still existed an actor capable of touching layers of emotion that not everyone could reach. And from there recognition began to return, not loudly like the early days, not with fanfare, but like a slow adjustment, an acknowledgement that he had never lost his ability, only that there had been periods when it was not seen clearly. But what was more important did not lie in how others saw him but in how he saw himself, because in this phase he no longer ran after what the market demanded, no longer tried to maintain a certain image, no longer placed heavy emphasis on having to prove anything to anyone. His choices began to come more from within, from what he felt was meaningful, from roles that allowed him to reconnect with himself. And in that process he not only found freedom in his work again, but also found a part of himself that he had once thought he had lost. Working for him at this point was no longer a way to exist or to solve immediate problems, but return to its original nature, a way to express, to explore, to understand more deeply what lay inside. And that very change made each role different, not because of scale or budget, but because of the way he approached it, an approach not dominated by the fear of being replaced, not driven by the pressure to maintain position, but by the desire to do something truthful, even if it was not always widely accepted. In moments like that, the gap between his two lives began to narrow, not because one life disappeared, but because they gradually merged in a more natural way, where the person he showed to the public was no longer too different from the person he felt inside, and even though that harmony was not perfect, not always stable, it still brought a feeling he had not had for a long time, a feeling of connection, not only with work but with himself, a feeling that after everything that had happened, he could still find a point of balance, even if that balance did not match any standard others set. And perhaps the most notable thing in this return was not that he was recognized again, but that he no longer needed that recognition in the way he once did. He no longer needed to prove that he still had value, because he already knew it from within. And that very change in perception made everything lighter, not because his life became easier, but because he was no longer bound by what he once thought was necessary to exist. And in that lightness, another form of strength appeared. Not loud, not showy, but solid enough to keep him standing firm, to continue moving forward, not to go back to the way things were before, but to continue in the way he truly was. And when everything gradually settled, not in the way stories usually end, with no perfect moment where everything was resolved, with no straight line leading to complete peace, Nicolas Cage stood at a point where he could look back at his entire journey, from the early days in a family where the name came before him, through the years of trying to escape a definition he did not choose, through the unsteady steps when he was not yet accepted, the moments of success that did not bring relief, the periods when life seemed pulled off its orbit, the relationships that came and went, the assets that were built and then lost, the pressures that could not always be put into words, and all of that did not exist as separate parts but connected together into a continuous flow, a story with no clear stopping point, only transitions from one form to another, from one pressure to another, from one loss to another. He did not achieve complete stability. There was no state where everything was in the right place, where every question had an answer, and perhaps that had never truly existed in his life, because from the beginning, balance had been something fragile, something he had to search for rather than be given, and throughout that journey, he did not always find it. There were times he came close, there were times he went further away, but he had never held it long enough to call it permanent. The two lives he had lived for many years, one life in front of the public and one life inside, were no longer separated as before, not because one disappeared, but because they gradually merged in a way that he no longer tried to separate. He no longer had to keep a perfect image on the outside while inside it was different, no longer had to create distance between the real person and the person seen, but began to accept that both were parts of himself, that everything he had been through, whether success or failure, had contributed to the person he was now, and trying to separate them only made everything more complicated. That acceptance did not come immediately. It was not a simple decision but the result of many years of facing what could not be changed, of mistakes that could not be gone back to fix, of losses that could not be taken back. And in that process, he gradually understood that there were things that did not need to be completely resolved for life to continue, that carrying wounds did not mean one could not keep walking, that a person did not need to be perfect to continue existing. He accepted what had happened, not by forgetting but by letting it stay there as a part of the story, a part that could not be separated, and in that acceptance, a form of lightness appeared, not because everything became better, but because he no longer fought against what had become part of him, no longer tried to become a different version, but lived with the person he had become after all the upheavals. Work, which had once been a burden, an obligation, a way to exist, now became a familiar part of life again, no longer carrying the same pressure as before, but also not completely separated from what he had been through. He still continued to work, still stood in front of the camera, still stepped into new roles, not because he needed to prove anything, but because that was what he knew how to do. It was how he connected with the world. It was how he maintained a rhythm in life that, if missing, everything could become more fragmented. But even in those moments, the wounds did not disappear. They were still there, in the silences, in passing thoughts, in unspoken emotions. And he did not try to erase them, did not try to pretend they did not exist, but carried them with him as a part of the journey, as a part of himself. And perhaps that was exactly what made his existence different, not because he had overcome everything, but because he still continued, even though he had never truly escaped. There are people who reach a point in life where they can say everything has stabilized, that they have found balance, that they have closed old chapters to start a new one. But for Nicolas Cage, life did not work that way. It did not close, did not start again clearly, but continued to flow, carrying everything that had happened. And in that flow, he did not try to stop it, did not try to make it simpler, but only continued to walk, day by day, step by step, in a journey that did not always have a clear direction, but still had one thing that did not change. He did not disappear. And perhaps, in everything he had been through, that was the most noteworthy thing, not the successes, not the failures, but the fact that he was still there, still continuing, still existing, even after losing so many things that others might see as irreplaceable, and that very existence, imperfect, incomplete, but persistent, had become what defined the person he was more than any title or image the world had ever attached to him, a person remembered not because he never fell, but because he had fallen many times, and still continued to stand up, not to prove anything to others, but to continue living in a life that had never stopped moving. The story of Nicolas Cage is not only the journey of a Hollywood star, but a profound reflection of the price of fame in modern American society, where success is often measured by the spotlight, but rarely sees the cracks behind it. From a man born in the oversized shadow of the Coppola family, he tried to erase his own surname to search for his own identity, but in return came years of doubt and isolation. Then when he reached the peak with the Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas, where he embodied a character destroying himself, that success did not bring healing but opened a new phase of pressure and alienation. Next came the broken marriages with Patricia Arquette and Lisa Marie Presley, the efforts to find personal stability but without success, along with the financial collapse when he was forced to sell off assets that were once symbols of success. All of that showed a very American truth, that the dream of success never guarantees inner peace, and sometimes the very system that celebrates the individual unintentionally isolates them. Especially when his image was turned into memes on the internet, when the public laughed at expressions they did not understand. That was when society revealed a cold side, where people were reduced to consumable images. But what is admirable about Nicolas Cage does not lie in the fact that he never made mistakes, but in the fact that he did not disappear. He continued to work, continued to stand in front of the camera even when misunderstood, when he had to accept roles that were critically panned just to pay debts and maintain his life, and especially in the role of a father when he faced the difficulties of his son Weston without being able to control them. Those were the moments that showed he was not a distant legend, but a real human being fighting. And the lesson for the American people is not to avoid failure, but to learn how to exist with it, because in a society that values individual success, what is more important than anything is not how much you achieve, but how long you can keep walking when things are no longer as you wish. And that very persistence, even if imperfect, is what deserves to be honored. If the story of Nicolas Cage makes you think about the price of fame and the power of resilience, please hit subscribe and leave a heart to support truthful stories like this one. Thank you for staying until the end of the journey, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the lives that the world thinks it has understood, but has never truly seen completely.